How do you destroy an enemy that you cannot reach? Not an enemy hiding behind walls, not one protected by distance or terrain. Enemy that is everywhere, embedded in the fabric of an entire country, running hospitals, winning elections, commanding the most heavily armed non-state military force on Earth. Enemy whose leader has not been seen in public for years, whose fighters use no smartphones, who built their entire security doctrine around the assumption that anything connected to a network is already compromised. How do you reach inside that? The answer, it turns out, is that you don't reach inside. You wait to be invited. 2014, a mid-ranking Mossad case officer whose name has never been made public walked into a senior director's office in Tel Aviv carrying a single walkie-talkie. Put it on the table. He did not put it there to demonstrate the device. He put it there because he wanted to hide a bomb inside it. He needed permission to spend the next several years, possibly a decade, building the infrastructure to do that at scale. The officer, identified in later reporting only by the alias Michael, had spent years watching Hezbollah do something that intelligence analysts found genuinely concerning: getting better. Not louder, not larger, better, more disciplined, more operationally serious, more difficult to penetrate through the methods that had worked before. Since the 2006 war with Israel, Hezbollah had rebuilt itself with a level of institutional rigor that most nation-state militaries would envy, had structured its command hierarchies, compartmentalized its cells. Critically, it had pushed its members off consumer electronics entirely. Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah had been saying the same thing publicly for years. Smartphones were Israeli intelligence infrastructure. Carry one and you were handing the enemy your location, your contacts, your conversations. The organization's response was not suggestion, it was doctrine. Fighters were moved to encrypted radios and pagers, receive only devices that broadcast no traceable signal. From the outside, this looked like paranoia. From Michael's desk, it looked like a procurement pattern. Hezbollah needed specific hardware, not consumer hardware, purpose-built communications equipment sourced through commercial intermediaries who had established relationships with the organization's logistics networks. The supply chain had geography, it had vendors, it had a rhythm. Wherever a supply chain had rhythm, it had a seam. Michael's proposal was not sophisticated in concept, it was radical in scale. Don't intercept the hardware after Hezbollah receives it. Don't attempt to compromise their communications by infiltrating the network. Manufacture the devices yourself. Build the bomb into the product, then sell it to them. Become their supplier. His director listened, then told him no. Because the idea was operationally wrong. It wasn't. The logic was sound, the seam was real. But the infrastructure required to exploit it, the front companies, the product lines, the international distribution networks, the plausible commercial identity that would survive scrutiny from a procurement team that had every reason to be suspicious, this was not an operation. It was an architecture. It would take years to build. It could be discovered at any stage. If it was discovered before detonation, Mossad would not simply lose the operation. They would hand Hezbollah proof with documentation of a years-long infiltration attempt. The intelligence and political damage would extend far beyond Lebanon. Michael argued for 2 weeks. He did not win the argument. He outlasted it. The operation was approved, not because leadership was convinced it would succeed. It was approved because no one in that room could prove it wouldn't. The distinction mattered more than it seemed at the time. The first phase of the operation involved walkie-talkies. Hezbollah's fighters used them in tactical contexts carried during operations, stored between them. Not ideal for Michael's purposes, but a starting point, a proof of concept, a way to build the supply chain infrastructure, test the deception architecture, and establish vendor credibility before moving to something more ambitious. The explosive device was concealed inside a modified battery. The battery looked normal, performed normally. The walkie-talkie functioned exactly as advertised because the operation only worked if the devices were trusted, distributed, and kept in active use. Over the following years, Mossad manufactured and sold more than 16,000 of them. 16,000 explosive devices moving through a commercial supply chain into the inventory of an organization that had no idea what it was buying. Each device had a remote trigger, a signal that, when sent, would detonate the explosive charge inside the battery. 16,000 triggers waiting for a command that had not been issued. Hezbollah received them, deployed them, trained with them, trusted them. They had no reason not to. The devices worked perfectly. Michael's team had understood the structural limitation from the beginning, even if they had not said it aloud in the initial authorization meeting. Walkie-talkies were battlefield equipment. They were worn during operations. Between operations, they went back into storage. Operative on a Tuesday afternoon, running logistics, coordinating finances, attending a meeting, they were not carrying a walkie-talkie. They were carrying whatever they carried every day, something personal, something habitual, something that was on their body not because a protocol required it, but because daily life did. To do what Michael had originally envisioned, a simultaneous detonation targeting not just fighters in the field but the full operational depth of the organization, commanders and coordinators and financial officers and communications managers, you needed a different device entirely. Something smaller, something that people carried not in a vest but in a pocket, something that felt personal rather than tactical. This is where Gabriel entered the operation. Gabriel, not his real name, not his real voice, when he later spoke about this publicly, was a senior Mossad officer who had been working adjacent to Michael's operation for years. He understood the walkie-talkie phase not as the operation but as the rehearsal. 2022, his team identified something specific in Hezbollah's procurement behavior. The organization was expanding its use of pagers. This required a moment to sit with. Pagers were, by 2022, functionally extinct in the civilian world. Consumer demand had evaporated with the rise of smartphones. Most manufacturers had abandoned the market. The devices were considered nostalgic at best, irrelevant at worst. But Nasrallah had not been speaking metaphorically when he warned his fighters about smartphones. The pager had real operational value for an organization built around the assumption that any network device was a liability. Receive only, no GPS, no microphone that could be remotely activated, no SIM card, no data trail. Hezbollah was buying them in volume. Specifically, they were sourcing the Gold Apollo AR-94, manufactured by a Taiwanese company with a clean commercial reputation and no obvious connection to anyone's intelligence services. Gabriel looked at that procurement pattern and saw the same thing Michael had seen in the walkie-talkie market 8 years earlier. A seam. He walked into his director's office. He put a pager on the table. His director told him no one would buy it. The device would need to be slightly enlarged to accommodate an explosive payload, enlarged enough that an experienced procurement team, comparing a new shipment against a previous one, might notice the difference in dimensions, in weight, in the feel of the casing. Gabriel said he understood the problem. He also said he had a solution for it. The solution was not technical, it was theatrical. The answer to the comparison problem was to ensure that Hezbollah never had a previous version to compare against. Not an upgraded product, not a replacement device. A new product line, one that Hezbollah adopted as their standard, before they had any baseline measurement to hold it against. To do that, Mossad couldn't just manufacture the device. They had to become the supplier, officially, commercially, credibly. They had to make Hezbollah believe they were buying from a Taiwanese company they already trusted, which meant Mossad needed to become, in every documentable sense, that company. How do you make a spy agency look like a consumer electronics distributor? How do you build a commercial identity convincing enough to pass scrutiny from a procurement team that has spent years hardening itself against exactly this kind of infiltration? How do you do it while 16,000 explosive walkie-talkies are already deployed inside the organization you're selling to? Devices that could be discovered, traced, and used to unravel everything you're about to build. Those were the questions Gabriel brought out of his director's office in 2022. 2 weeks to start answering them. There is a version of this story where the hard part was building the bomb. It wasn't. It's explosive itself, petin, a high-yield plastic compound that can be compressed into a space smaller than a matchbook, was not the engineering challenge. Mossad had chemists. They had a manufacturing facility inside Israel. They had, after 8 years of the walkie-talkie operation, a production process that worked. The hard part was everything around the bomb. The paper, the addresses, the phone numbers that answered, the email threads that felt real, the commercial history that could survive a background check by a procurement officer who had every professional reason to be suspicious. The hard part was making the world believe that the most dangerous object Hezbollah would ever hold was something they had chosen freely, from a supplier they trusted, at a price that felt right. Gabriel's team began with what already existed. Gold Apollo was a real company. Based in Taiwan, founded in 1995, roughly 40 employees, a legitimate position in the pager market, particularly in North America and Europe. AR-924 model was the specific device Hezbollah had been sourcing. Clean reputation, intelligence flags, no reason for suspicion. Gabriel needed was a bridge, a commercial entity that could sit between Gold Apollo's brand and Hezbollah's procurement network, close enough to be credible, distant enough that the connection to Israel could never be traced directly. Bridge already existed too. A Hungarian company called Consulting KFT held a licensing arrangement with Gold Apollo, a contract that permitted it to manufacture and sell pagers under the Gold Apollo brand in certain markets. BA Consulting had ordinary clients. It had a legitimate commercial identity, had, crucially, no reason to believe that anything unusual was being asked of it. Mossad did not expose BAC Consulting. They used its position in the supply chain as scaffolding. Behind that scaffolding, they built something else entirely. The construction took months. Websites, not placeholder pages, fully developed product sites with specifications, pricing tiers, regional distributor contacts, and customer support infrastructure. Online storefronts, forum discussions seeded across procurement communities where buyers verified vendor credibility. Digital presence that, if searched, returned exactly what a careful buyer would expect to find: an established, mid-tier electronics supplier with a clean history and no red flags. Mossad also established a presence under the name Apollo Systems HK, a Hong Kong entity that in Hong Kong corporate records did not exist. But it existed where it needed to exist, in search results, in distribution catalogs, in the paper trail that a Hezbollah logistics officer would follow if they decided to verify who they were actually buying from. Every layer pointed to another layer. Every layer was real enough to absorb a surface check. None of them, if followed far enough, led anywhere that was actually true. Gabriel called it something specific in a later interview. He said it was like the 1998 film The Truman Show, a world constructed entirely for one audience, with every detail managed by people the audience would never see. The set looked like reality because the people living inside it had no reason to look at the walls. Hezbollah was Truman, and Mossad had been building the set since 2014. But here is where the assumption from Phase 1 begins to fracture. Michael's original proposal, the one that had taken 2 weeks to get approved, had been built on a specific premise. The premise was that the operation's greatest risk was exposure during the manufacturing phase. Build the devices carefully enough, establish the supply chain plausibly enough, and once the products were in Hezbollah's hands, the hard work was done. Gabriel's team discovered, sometime in mid-2023, that this was wrong. Hard work was not done when the products arrived. The hard work was continuous, because a supply chain is not a one-time transaction. It is a relationship. Relationships require maintenance. Hezbollah's procurement team did not simply receive a shipment and file it away. They followed up. They requested additional units. They raised questions about specifications. They compared the pager's performance against their operational needs and came back with adjustments. Every one of those interactions was an exposure window. Every email that required a response, every order that needed to be processed, every question about battery life or device durability, all of it had to be handled by Mossad's infrastructure in real time, with the fluency of a company that had been in this business for years. Gabriel's team had built the set. Now they had to live in it. The saleswoman was the most delicate element. She was real. She had a name, a commercial history, a professional relationship with Hezbollah's procurement contacts that predated the operation by years. She had sold Gold Apollo products legitimately. She was trusted specifically because she was not Mossad, because anyone who checked her background would find nothing unusual. She did not know she was working for Israeli intelligence. Mossad brought her into the operational structure through what appeared to be a straightforward business arrangement connected to the BAC consulting product line. She was offered a commercial role. She took it. She offered Hezbollah the first batch of modified pagers as an upgrade, free of charge, an introductory offer. Kind of thing a supplier does when they want to convert a client to a new product line. Hezbollah accepted. From their perspective, a vendor they already trusted was offering them an improved version of a device they were already using, at no initial cost, with the backing of a brand they had already verified. They had no reason to hesitate. By late 2023, the modified pagers were moving into Hezbollah's distribution network. By early 2024, they were in operational use. By the summer of 2024, approximately 5,000 of them were in active circulation, carried daily by fighters, coordinators, logisticians, and mid-level commanders across Lebanon and parts of Syria. This is the moment where the operation looks, from the outside, like it has worked. The devices are deployed, the supply chain held. The saleswoman played her role without ever knowing she had one. 5,000 explosive pagers are sitting in the pockets of Hezbollah operatives who trust them completely. But inside the operation, in the summer of 2024, Gabriel's team is not celebrating. They are managing a problem that the original authorization meeting in 2014 had not fully accounted for. Problem that Michael had understood in the abstract but had not solved. A problem that, if it resolves in the wrong direction, does not simply end the operation. Ends everything. Sometime in the early months of 2024, fragments of intelligence reached Gabriel's unit, suggesting that elements within Hezbollah's internal security apparatus had begun asking questions. Not the right questions. Specific questions about the pager supply chain or the Gold Apollo product line, or the dimensions of the AR-924 compared to previous shipments. Questions. The nature of the inquiry has never been publicly confirmed. What has been reported is the effect it had inside Mossad. It forced a conversation that no one in the operation wanted to have. Was the operation compromised? The honest answer Gabriel's team concluded was, we don't know. That was the most dangerous answer possible. Because the operation had been built on a very specific kind of certainty, the certainty that Hezbollah did not know. The moment that certainty became uncertain, every calculation changed. There were three possibilities. The first, Hezbollah's questions were routine. Supply chain verification that any professional security organization runs periodically. The kind of audit that would find nothing, because the fake world had been built carefully enough to absorb exactly this kind of surface scrutiny. The second, Hezbollah had identified a specific anomaly, a dimension discrepancy, a weight variation, a paper trail that dead-ended somewhere it shouldn't, and was in the process of following it. The operation was compromised and Mossad didn't know it yet. The third, Hezbollah had already completed the investigation, had already understood what they were holding, and was now managing the information strategically, waiting to see if Israel would detonate, using the undetonated devices as a counterintelligence tool, building a picture of Mossad's capabilities before deciding how to respond. Each possibility required a different response. Gabriel's team could not determine, from the intelligence available to them, which one was true. Inside Mossad, the argument that followed was not clean. One faction held that the operation should be activated immediately, before any investigation could harden into certainty. The devices were in position. The target population was carrying them. The window existed right now today, and waiting made it smaller with every hour. Opposing argument was more uncomfortable. It went like this. If Hezbollah had already identified the operation and was managing it strategically, then detonating now was exactly what they wanted. It would confirm Mossad's capabilities, hand them a propaganda catastrophe, and potentially expose the full architecture of the supply chain deception, including the saleswoman, the BC consulting infrastructure, the Gold Apollo connection, to public and legal scrutiny. Detonating into a trap was worse than not detonating at all. The discussion reached the level of Mossad director Dadi Barnea. Barnea did not have a clean answer either. What he had was a deadline that wasn't written anywhere. A deadline defined purely by uncertainty. The longer the operation sat unactivated, the more time Hezbollah had to find what it was looking for. Activating without knowing what Hezbollah already knew meant committing to a course of action with incomplete information. That is not an unusual condition in intelligence work. It is, however, the condition under which operations fail. Gabriel's team had one more problem. A quieter one. One that had been sitting underneath the operation since the saleswoman made her first delivery. She was still active, still working, still in communication with Hezbollah's procurement contacts, still processing orders, still answering questions about the product line, unaware entirely of what she had helped deliver. If the operation detonated and the investigation that followed traced the supply chain backward, as it inevitably would, her role would become visible. Not her knowledge of it, her role. The commercial bridge between a Mossad front operation and a terrorist organization's logistics network. What happened to her after that was not a question the operation had been designed to answer. It was a cost that had been built into the architecture from the beginning. Cost that no one had resolved. A cost that was still unresolved on the day Barnea sat down to make his decision. 5,000 devices deployed waiting. No one in the room entirely certain what Hezbollah already knew. The authorization did not come as a clear directive. That is worth understanding before anything else. There was no moment where Dadi Barnea stood in a room, reviewed a final checklist, and gave a clean order. What happened was closer to a gradual narrowing, a series of internal reviews through July and August of 2024, in which the options available to the operation contracted one by one until the only thing left was a date. Even the date was contested. Gabriel's team had proposed September as the activation window, based on one calculation above all others, the intelligence suggesting Hezbollah's internal security questions had not stopped. They had continued, slowly without urgency, in the way that bureaucratic security reviews move inside large organizations, but continuously. The assessment was that Hezbollah had not yet identified the specific anomaly, but they were in the vicinity of it. Thorough dimensional audit of the AR 924 units against Gold Apollo's published specifications would reveal a discrepancy in casing thickness. Dramatic, a few millimeters. The kind of difference that gets overlooked in a casual inspection and gets found in a deliberate one. Whether Hezbollah was conducting a casual inspection or a deliberate one, that was the question Gabriel's team could not answer. What they could answer was this: the longer the devices sat unactivated, the higher the probability that the inspection became deliberate. September was not chosen because it was ideal. It was chosen because October was worse. The first problem arrived before the operation even began. In the final week of August, a separate Israeli operation, unconnected to the pager program, targeting a different Hezbollah figure through a different method, resulted in a series of Hezbollah security alerts across Lebanon. Nothing that touched the supply chain, nothing that indicated awareness of the devices. The alerts pushed Hezbollah's internal communications into an elevated caution posture. Field units were told to reduce non-essential electronic contact. Some pagers were pulled from circulation temporarily, held in storage rather than carried on body, while security assessments ran their course. For approximately 11 days in late August and early September, the number of pagers in active daily use, on the bodies of operatives, in pockets and belt clips, where a detonation would cause the intended damage, dropped significantly below the 5,000 figure the operation had been built around. Gabriel's team ran the numbers. A detonation during that window would still cause mass casualties, but it would not reach the full operational depth of Hezbollah's structure. Mid-level commanders who had pulled back from daily pager use would survive. Senior logisticians whose devices were in storage rather than on their person would survive. Decapitation effect, the simultaneous removal of operational capacity across every level of the organization, would be incomplete. The operation had a target threshold. The August window fell below it. Barnea was advised. The date was pushed. This was the first false start. By September 10th, Hezbollah's elevated caution posture had relaxed. The separate security alert had run its course without producing any actionable finding. Pager use returned to normal distribution patterns. The operational window reopened. But something had shifted in the internal calculus. The 11-day delay had consumed time the operation did not have in reserve. Gabriel's team was now working with a tighter margin between the new activation window and the point at which their intelligence assessment said Hezbollah's procurement audit would reach the specific question about device dimensions. They had in the team's internal framing approximately 2 weeks. The date was set for September 17th. What Gabriel's team did not know, could not have known, was that Hezbollah's security review had moved faster than projected during the 11-day elevated caution period. Not in the direction of the pagers, in a different direction entirely. Hezbollah's internal security apparatus had spent the August alert period conducting a broad sweep of their electronics procurement records, looking for any supplier relationship that had not been independently verified in the previous 18 months. The Gold Apollo product line had been flagged, not because anything specific had been identified, but because it was newer than most of their established supply relationships and had not gone through the most recent verification cycle. The flag was not an investigation, it was a calendar entry, a note that verification was due. The verification had been scheduled for late September. Gabriel's team, operating on their own intelligence assessment, believed they had 2 weeks before Hezbollah's review approached the danger zone, actually had 11 days. The activation date of September 17th was not a safe margin, was without anyone on Gabriel's team knowing it, a near miss measured in days. The incorrect assumption that 2 weeks remained was the operational belief that the entire final timeline had been built around. It was wrong. On the morning of September 17th, before the activation signal was sent, Gabriel received a report that produced something close to paralysis in the operational room. Hezbollah procurement officer, one of the individuals who had handled the Gold Apollo account directly, had made an unscheduled inquiry to one of the intermediary entities in Mossad's supply chain architecture, the core front company, a peripheral node, distributor contact who existed on paper and was managed by a Mossad liaison who maintained the commercial persona on a rotating basis. Query was routine in language. A question about a future order. Specifications for a potential additional shipment. But it was unscheduled. It had not followed the normal procurement cycle. It had arrived on the morning of the activation date. The operational room divided immediately. One reading routine procurement activity. The contact was a live commercial relationship. Scheduled inquiries happened in normal business contexts. There was no reason to assign significance to the timing. The second reading, Hezbollah's security review, had progressed faster than assessed, had reached the Gold Apollo account, and was now probing the supply chain actively, using a mundane procurement inquiry as cover for testing whether the vendor relationship held under unplanned contact. The second reading was correct. Activating now meant detonating into a partially aware adversary. Hezbollah's security apparatus would have a running start on the post-blast investigation. The supply chain would unravel faster. The saleswoman's exposure window would compress. If the first reading was correct and the operation was aborted, there might not be another window. The calendar entry for late September verification existed. Hezbollah's team ran that verification and found the dimensional discrepancy. The devices would be pulled from circulation. 16,000 walkie-talkies and 5,000 pagers, a decade of infrastructure, would be discovered, documented, and turned against Israel in every available forum. Gabriel recommended abort pending further assessment. Barnea overruled him. The signal went out at 3:28 p.m. For 90 seconds, nothing happened. This was expected. The detonation sequence required the pager's internal firmware to process the trigger command before initiating the battery charge that would ignite the peton. Seconds was within the normal processing window. At 3:30 p.m., the first devices detonated. For a period of approximately 4 minutes, the detonation pattern was wrong. The operational model had predicted near simultaneous detonations across the full distribution network, a cascade of explosions so compressed in time that Hezbollah's command structure would have no window to issue warnings, pull devices, or respond before the damage was complete. What happened in the first 4 minutes was sequential, not simultaneous. Detonations were occurring, but in clusters with gaps between them. The cascade was uneven. Gabriel's team did not know why. The leading theory, generated in real time, was that some portion of the pager network had been moved to a low-power standby mode, either because of the August security alert or because of normal battery conservation protocols, and those devices were taking longer to process the trigger signal. The secondary theory was worse, that a portion of the network had been identified and physically secured, and those devices were never going to detonate because they were no longer on anyone's body. For 4 minutes, neither theory could be confirmed. For 4 minutes, the operation's actual scale was unknown. Then the cascade completed. The gaps closed. The detonation pattern expanded across Lebanon and into Syria, reaching the full distribution network within 9 minutes of the initial signal. Inside the operational room, the preliminary damage assessment began arriving. Hospitals overwhelmed. Communications infrastructure across Hezbollah's network dark or fragmented. Field units unable to reach command. Command unable to reach field units. The number was still climbing. Thousands injured, dozens dead. Gabriel looked at the board and said nothing for a long moment. He said, "Check the walkie-talkies, because the pagers were Phase 2. Phase 1 had been waiting considerably longer." The hospitals did not know what they were treating. This is the first thing to understand about the hours following 3:30 p.m. on September 17th. Lebanon's emergency medical system absorbed thousands of casualties in under 30 minutes, and the physicians receiving them had no framework for what had happened. The injuries did not present like a bombing. They did not present like a missile strike or a collapse. They presented like something that had no established category: hands destroyed at close range, faces lacerated, eyes ruptured, fingers missing at the second knuckle, bilateral hand trauma in patient after patient after patient. Emergency wards that had been staffed for a routine Tuesday afternoon were performing triage on a mass casualty event with no warning, no coordination from civil defense authorities, who were themselves trying to understand what had happened, and no ability to request mutual aid from hospitals that were simultaneously managing their own overflow. The medical system did not fail, but it bent in ways that took months to straighten. Inside Hezbollah's command structure, the first 90 minutes after the detonation were defined by a single problem. No one could safely use any device to determine what had happened. The organization that had built its entire security doctrine around the assumption that network consumer electronics were compromised was now facing the possibility that the alternative, the hardware they had chosen specifically because it could not be tracked or remotely accessed, had been weaponized against them in the same way, but more patiently. Field commanders could not call headquarters. Headquarters could not reach field units. The communications architecture that Hezbollah had spent 18 years building as a counter-surveillance measure had become, in 90 minutes, the primary vector of the attack. Instinct was to go dark entirely, which is what they did. Going dark meant that Hezbollah's command structure, in the immediate aftermath of the worst security breach in the organization's history, had no ability to assess its own damage, coordinate a response, or communicate with the Iranian principals who were demanding to understand what had just happened. The silence was not a safe condition. It was a second wound. The walkie-talkies detonated on September 18th. Gabriel had given the order to hold Phase 1, the walkie-talkie trigger, until the pager assessment was complete. The logic was sequencing. Activate the newer, more distributed network first, then detonate the older hardware while Hezbollah's command structure was still processing the initial attack. What the sequencing produced was something the operational model had not fully anticipated. The second-day detonations did not land as a continuation of September 17th. They landed as a revelation. Hezbollah had spent the overnight hours attempting to construct a theory of what had happened. The working assumption among their security leadership, informed by the fact that the pagers were a relatively recent acquisition, was that the supply chain had been compromised at some point in the previous 2 to 3 years. Finite window, a bounded infiltration. The walkie-talkies destroyed that theory completely. Those devices had been in Hezbollah's inventory for nearly a decade. Some of them had been carried through the 2019 protests, the 2020 Beirut port explosion, the 2021 government formation period, the escalation following October 7th. Some of them had been in storage for years, trusted precisely because they were old enough to predate whatever recent penetration the organization was now trying to identify. The revelation was not just that Mossad had gotten inside the supply chain. It was that they had been inside it for 10 years, and Hezbollah had never known. At least 25 more people died on September 18th. Over 600 were injured. More than 70 fires burned across Beirut and other parts of Lebanon. The physical damage was significant. The psychological damage was of a different order entirely. Hassan Nasrallah gave a televised address 2 days after the pager detonations. Gabriel watched it. He described what he saw in terms that were not triumphant. He said, "If you looked at Nasrallah's eyes, you were looking at a man who had already lost. The speech, the war. A leader whose fighters had watched devices explode on the bodies of people standing next to them, and who now understood that the organization's most carefully maintained security protocols had been for a decade providing false comfort. The address was intended to project continuity. What it communicated to anyone watching closely was fracture. 10 days later, on September 27th, Nasrallah was dead. Israel's Air Force dropped munitions on his underground command bunker in Beirut's southern suburbs. The strike was made possible, in part, by a condition the pager operation had created. Nasrallah had been forced to conduct command meetings in person, in physical locations, with commanders who were present in the same room. The communications network he had relied on for remote coordination was gone. The organization that had prided itself on its counter-surveillance sophistication was now moving its senior leadership through physical space, which is trackable in ways that encrypted radio traffic is not. The pager operation had not just injured 3,000 people. It had driven Hezbollah's leadership into the targeting window that killed their commander. Ali Karki, the commander of Hezbollah's southern front, died in the same strike. Iranian Revolutionary Guard General Abbas Nilfarushan, deputy commander for operations, died alongside him. Single munitions package made possible by a communications collapse that had begun 11 days earlier with a batch of pagers offered free of charge. By November 2024, a ceasefire had been reached. The Assad regime in Syria, sustained for years by Hezbollah's military support, collapsed. Iran's axis of resistance, the network of proxy forces that Tehran had constructed across 3 decades and several $billion, entered 2025 in structural ruin. Hezbollah's military wing had been decimated. Its command depth had been hollowed out. Its successor leadership was managing an organization that no longer trusted its own procurement history. Qassem, Hezbollah's new leader, said publicly what his predecessors would never have admitted. The breach had been, in his words, extraordinary. Explosives had been undetectable by standard checks. There had been a major gap in procurement. They had believed the purchase was disguised and untraceable. It had not been. The saleswoman was never publicly identified. What happened to her after September 17th, whether she understood her role, whether she was questioned by Lebanese authorities, whether Hezbollah's post-blast investigation traced the supply chain far enough to reach her, none of that has been confirmed in any public reporting. What is known is that she had been a commercial bridge between a Mossad front operation and a terrorist organization's procurement network, without ever knowing it. Professional credibility, her standing relationships, her years of legitimate commercial work, all of it had been used as scaffolding for an operation she had no knowledge of and no ability to consent to. The cost to her was a cost the operation had accepted from the beginning. A line item in an architecture that had never been designed to protect her. Gabriel, in his later interview, did not address her directly. The omission was not accidental. The supply chain itself, the methodology, the architecture, the decade-long proof of concept did not disappear when the devices detonated. September 17th demonstrated, in documented and publicly available detail, was that a national intelligence agency could manufacture consumer electronics, establish a plausible commercial identity across multiple jurisdictions, leverage legitimate vendor relationships without those vendors' knowledge, and deliver explosive devices to a target population at scale, with a patient timeline measured in years rather than months. Every intelligence service that watched the detonations understood this, not as a lesson in what Israel had done, as a lesson in what was possible. The vulnerability that the operation exploited, the gap between what an organization believes about its equipment and what is actually inside it, did not close on September 17th. Widened because now the methodology was proven. It had worked against the most surveillance-conscious non-state military force in the Middle East, an organization that had built its entire doctrine around the assumption that its hardware could be trusted. The hardware could not be trusted, and now everyone knew it. Michael had walked into a director's office in 2014 with a walkie-talkie and a proposal. The proposal was approved not because anyone believed it would work, but because no one could prove it wouldn't. What followed was 10 years of a fake world, fake companies, fake salespeople, fake product lines, sustained by the patience of people whose names will likely never be confirmed, delivered through a woman who will likely never be publicly named, detonated on the authorization of a director who made his final decision with incomplete information, on a timeline that was narrower than anyone in the operational room understood. Worked measurably, historically. It left behind, in the rubble of Beirut and in the procurement records of every intelligence service that studied what happened, a question that has no clean answer. If it worked here against them, where else has it already worked? Against whom? When does that one go off? Hidden Ops covers the operations that don't make the official record. Scribe new operations every week.